A billionaire visits his daughter's grave, only to find a janitor crying there, clutching twin babies he never knew existed. But what happens when a wealthy father discovers his daughter hid her children from him, and now those babies are orphans in the arms of a stranger? Glenn Murdoch's life was a fortress of steel and silence. At 68, his silver hair and cold gray eyes reflected a man who'd conquered industries but destroyed his family. His name gleamed on hospital wings across 3 states. Wall Street called him the Titan. But in his empty mansion, Glenn heard only ghosts. Elara Grace Murdoch, dead 13 months. A highway accident in the rain. She was 24. Glenn had been in Singapore finalizing a $2 billion merger when the call came at 3 a.m. The flight back took 18 hours. By the time he reached the morgue, her skin was cold as stone. He'd arrived too late. Again, just like he'd missed her college graduation for a meeting in Dubai. She'd stopped calling him Dad after that. Welcome back to Mano Tales. Before the story begins, do me 2 quick favors. First, hit that subscribe and like button. It takes less than 5 seconds and helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. Second, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. It helps us see how far stories of loss, redemption, and unexpected connection travel across the world. Now, let's begin. Glenn's driver had offered to wait, but he'd waved him off. The cemetery was his private ritual. Every Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., rain or shine, for 13 months straight. The gravel crunched under his Italian leather shoes as he walked the familiar path toward Elara's grave, rehearsing the apology he could never deliver. But today, something was different. Someone was kneeling at Elara's headstone. A young man in a faded blue janitor's uniform rocked back and forth, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. In his arms, 2 babies wailed, their cries piercing the quiet morning air. The man's name tag read Vincent in red stitching. He looked no older than 26, exhausted, desperate. Glenn's blood went cold. "Get away from my daughter's grave." His voice came out like steel. "Now." Vincent's head snapped up. His face was pale, eyes red and swollen. When he saw Glenn's tailored suit and cold expression, he flinched. "You're Glenn Murdoch. You have 10 seconds before I call security. Please? Just listen. 9, 8. These are your grandchildren." Vincent's voice cracked, desperate and raw. Glenn froze mid-step. The word hung in the air like smoke. "What did you just say?" Vincent struggled to his feet, clutching the babies tighter. One of them, a little girl with cascading dark curls, stopped crying and stared at Glenn with enormous amber eyes. Elara's eyes. The exact shade Glenn remembered from the handful of times he'd actually looked at his daughter. But what Glenn didn't know yet was that this man was about to shatter every assumption he'd ever made. "My name is Vincent Torres. I worked with Elara at Riverside Community Center. She volunteered every Saturday." His words rushed out. "These are Leo and Mia. They're 13 months old, and they're Elara's children." Glenn's knees buckled. He grabbed the top of Elara's headstone to steady himself. The cold marble bit into his palm. "That's impossible. Elara would have told me." "Would she?" Vincent's voice turned sharp. "When, Mr. Murdoch? Between the calls you never returned? Or maybe during one of the birthdays you missed?" The words cut deeper than any knife. "Their father was Mateo Rivera, my best friend, a mechanic." Vincent's jaw tightened. He met Ilara 2 years ago when his car broke down, and he came to the center for help. They fell in love, hard, fast, real. He looked down at the babies. She knew you'd never accept him. He didn't summer in the Hamptons. He didn't have an Ivy League degree, so she hid it. Glenn's throat closed. She was pregnant and never told me? She tried. Vincent's voice dropped to something dangerous. Mr. Murdoch, Ilara called you 17 times in her last 2 months. I was there. I heard the voicemails she left. Dad, I need you. Please call me back. Dad, something happened. Dad, I'm scared. Please. His voice broke. She was crying. You never called. The cemetery spun around Glenn. He couldn't breathe. Mateo died when she was 8 months pregnant. Construction accident downtown. Scaffolding gave way. He fell 6 stories onto concrete. Vincent's hands trembled. I held him while he died. His last words were, "Protect my family." So I became their legal guardian. Then, 3 weeks after she gave birth, Ilara's car went off the bridge. Tears streamed down his face, and suddenly, I'm 26, with infant twins and 2 minimum-wage jobs, and I'm drowning. The little girl reached for Glenn, her tiny fingers opening and closing. Glenn stared at her hand, and then he saw it. On her wrist, a small crescent moon-shaped birthmark. His breath caught. Ilara had the exact same mark in the exact same place. Why are you here? Glenn whispered. Vincent's answer was simple and devastating. Because I can't do this alone anymore. Because these babies deserve family. He paused. And because Ilara left you something. He reached into his jacket with shaking hands and pulled out a sealed envelope. Yellowed. Creased. Ilara's handwriting on the front. To Dad. Open only if I'm gone. Glenn's hands trembled as he reached for it. But what he would read inside would reveal a truth so painful it would bring the great Glenn Murdoch to his knees. Because Ilara hadn't just hidden her children from fear, she'd hidden them because of something Glenn had said to her 3 years ago. Something he didn't even remember saying, something unforgivable. Glenn didn't open the letter at the cemetery. His hands shook too badly. Instead, he stood there frozen, staring at Ilara's name scrawled across the envelope, while Vincent waited in silence, the twins finally quiet in his arms. I need to verify your story. Glenn's voice came out mechanical, distant, the businessman in him taking control when the father couldn't. DNA tests, legal documentation, everything. Vincent's jaw tightened. Of course you do. The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. I'll send you Mateo's guardianship papers, the birth certificates, Ilara's will, whatever you need to feel safe from the poor people. The words stung because they were true. But what neither of them knew was that the verification process would take 3 agonizing days. 3 days where Glenn couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything except those amber eyes and that crescent moon birthmark. The DNA results came back on Friday afternoon, 99.97% probability of biological relationship. Glenn stared at the paper until the numbers blurred. He had grandchildren. Ilara had given him grandchildren, and he'd been too absent, too busy, too cold to even know she was pregnant. He called Vincent that night. The tests are positive. Glenn's voice was hollow. I want to help. I'll set up a trust fund. 5 million to start. Education, housing, whatever they need. No. Glenn blinked. Excuse me? I said no. Vincent's voice was flat, exhausted. I don't want your money, Mr. Murdoch. Money won't change their diapers at 3 a.m. Money won't hold them when they're crying. Money won't teach them they're loved. Then what do you want? Glenn's frustration bled through. I want you to meet them. Actually, meet them. Not write a check and disappear like you did with Alara. The line went quiet for a moment. I'm at 412 Riverside Avenue, apartment 2C. Come tomorrow. 2 p.m. If you want to know your grandchildren, you do it on their terms, not yours. The line went dead. Glenn sat in his penthouse that night, surrounded by leather and marble and emptiness, holding Alara's unopened letter. He still couldn't bring himself to read it, but something Vincent said had burrowed under his skin. Not yours, theirs. The next afternoon, Glenn's driver pulled up to a building that should have been condemned. Cracked windows, graffiti on the walls, a broken front door that didn't quite close. Glenn's security detail tensed, but he waved them back. He walked up 2 flights of stairs that smelled like mildew and cooking oil and knocked on a door with peeling green paint. Vincent opened it, surprised, like he hadn't actually expected Glenn to show. You came. I said I would. The apartment was smaller than Glenn's bathroom, a futon against one wall, a kitchenette with a hot plate. 2 cribs squeezed into the corner, barely leaving room to walk. But it was clean, painfully clean. Children's books stacked neatly on a crate, bottles drying on a towel, toys organized in a plastic bin. This was what love looked like when you had nothing else to give. The twins were awake, sitting on a blanket on the floor. The boy, Leo, banged a plastic cup against the ground. Mia reached for a stuffed elephant, giggling when she grabbed its trunk. Glenn stood frozen in the doorway. You can come in, Vincent said quietly. They don't bite. Glenn took 1 step, then another. His $1,000 shoes on worn linoleum felt obscene. He didn't know where to look, where to stand, what to do with his hands. Vincent picked up Mia and walked over. This is your grandfather. He looked at Glenn. You want to hold her? Glenn's throat closed. I haven't held a baby since Alara was... Then it's time you learned. Vincent placed Mia in Glenn's arms before he could protest. She was warm and solid and impossibly light all at once. She looked up at him with those amber eyes, Alara's eyes, and grabbed his tie with a tiny fist. Subscribe if you believe it's never too late to show up for the people you've failed. Only those who think some relationships are beyond repair will not subscribe. Glenn's carefully constructed walls crumbled. Hi, he whispered, his voice breaking. Hi, sweetheart. Mia gurgled and yanked his tie harder, completely unimpressed by his net worth. And for the first time in 13 months, Glenn Murdoch felt something other than regret. He felt hope. But what he still didn't know was that across town, someone else had just learned about the twins' existence. Someone who had their own plans for Alara's children. Someone Glenn hadn't spoken to in over a decade. His son, Julian, had just received an anonymous text message with a photo of Glenn holding a baby. And the message said only 3 words. Did you know? Glenn's penthouse had hosted presidents, tech moguls, and Hollywood celebrities. It had been featured in Architectural Digest twice, but it had never held children. He'd invited Vincent and the twins for Sunday brunch, thinking it would be easier on his territory. He'd had his chef prepare an elaborate spread. He'd hired a nanny service to be on standby. He'd even had his assistant baby-proof the sharp corners with foam padding that cost more per foot than Vincent probably made in a day. What Glenn hadn't prepared for was the sound. The moment Vincent stepped off the private elevator with the twins, Leo took one look at the towering floor-to-ceiling windows and the sprawling marble floors and started screaming. Not crying, screaming. The sound bounced off the hard surfaces and echoed through 4,500 square feet of cold, empty luxury. Mia joined in seconds later. Glenn's housekeeper, Margaret, who'd worked for him for 12 years, stood frozen with a silver tray of artisan cheeses, looking utterly lost. His chef emerged from the kitchen, then retreated immediately. Even his driver, waiting by the elevator, shifted uncomfortably. I'm sorry, Vincent muttered, bouncing Leo desperately. He gets overwhelmed in new places. It's fine, Glenn lied, raising his voice over the wailing. Please, sit down. Can I get you something? Water? Coffee? But there was nowhere to sit that made sense. The Italian leather sofas were too low, too white, too expensive. The dining table was a slab of black granite that could seat 16 but felt hostile to 2 infants. Vincent hovered near the entrance, looking like he wanted to bolt. Glenn tried to take Mia to help, but she arched her back and screamed louder, reaching for Vincent with both arms. The rejection stung more than Glenn wanted to admit. Maybe we should do this another time, Vincent said, already moving toward the elevator. No, please, Glenn looked around his penthouse, seeing it through new eyes. Everything was hard edges and cold surfaces. There wasn't a single soft place to land. No warmth, no color, no life. You're right. This was a mistake. But what Glenn didn't realize yet was that this disaster was about to teach him the most important lesson of his life. The next morning, Glenn showed up at Vincent's apartment at 7 a.m. with coffee and bagels. Vincent opened the door in sweatpants and a stained t-shirt, looking exhausted. What are you doing here? I want to help, really help. Not write checks, not hire people. Me. Glenn held up the bag. I brought breakfast. Vincent stared at him for a long moment, then stepped aside. What followed were the most humbling 3 hours of Glenn Murdoch's life. Vincent showed him how to change a diaper, which Glenn botched twice before getting it right. He taught him how to prepare formula at the exact right temperature, how to burp a baby without getting spit up on his shirt, which happened anyway. He demonstrated the specific way Mia liked to be rocked, and the particular bounce that calmed Leo down. Glenn, who'd negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, struggled to get a onesie over Mia's head. You're overthinking it, Vincent said, trying not to laugh. Babies aren't board meetings. You can't strategize your way through a diaper blowout. Clearly, Glenn looked down at his ruined Tom Ford shirt, now decorated with strained carrots. For some reason, he started laughing. Really laughing. For the first time in years. Vincent joined in, and for a moment, the cramped apartment felt bigger than Glenn's entire penthouse. Come back tomorrow, Vincent said as Glenn was leaving. Same time. You're terrible at this, but you showed up. That's more than most people do. Glenn nodded, something warm expanding in his chest. But neither of them knew that Glenn's son Julian was parked across the street, watching his father walk out of a rundown building with baby food on his designer shirt. Julian's hands gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. He'd spent 3 days investigating the anonymous text. 3 days digging into his dead sister's secrets, and what he'd discovered made him feel like he'd never known Ilara at all. Glenn thought he was building a bridge to his grandchildren. What he didn't know was that he was about to face the son he'd failed first, and Julian wasn't coming to reconcile. He was coming for answers. Angry, bitter answers that had been festering for 20 years. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt with good intentions alone. Julian was about to make sure his father understood that. 3 weeks changed everything. Glenn showed up at Vincent's apartment every morning at 7, rain or shine, weekday or weekend. The routine became sacred. Coffee for Vincent, diapers for the twins, bottles, books. The endless cycle of infant care that never stopped and somehow felt more meaningful than any corporate merger Glenn had ever closed. Leo started reaching for him, actually reaching. Tiny arms extended the moment Glenn walked through the door. And when Mia laughed for the first time while Glenn was making ridiculous faces at her, something in his chest cracked wide open. "She likes you," Vincent said, surprised. "I think I like me better when I'm here," Glenn admitted. But Vincent was drowning, and they both knew it. The night shift at the hospital, the day shift cleaning office buildings, the twins barely sleeping through the night. Vincent had dark circles under his eyes that never went away. His hands shook from exhaustion when he poured formula. Glenn watched him nearly collapse one morning and made a decision. "I want to set up a trust fund for the twins," he said carefully. "For their education, college, whatever they need when they're older." Vincent's jaw tightened. "We talked about this. I'm not trying to buy my way in. I'm already in. I'm their grandfather." Glenn kept his voice steady. "But I'm also watching you work yourself to death because you're too proud to accept help. That's not noble, Vincent. That's just suffering for suffering's sake. You don't understand what it's like." "You're right. I don't. I've never had to choose between electricity and groceries. I've never worked 2 jobs and still come up short." Glenn leaned forward. "But I do understand what it's like to lose someone you love because you were too stubborn to ask for help when you needed it. Don't make my mistakes." Vincent was quiet for a long moment. "What are you proposing?" "A trust, managed by a neutral third party. It pays for their education, medical expenses, things they'll need as they grow. But it doesn't pay your rent. It doesn't replace your role. You're still their guardian, still the person raising them." Glenn's voice softened. "I'm just trying to take some weight off your shoulders so you don't break." Vincent's eyes filled with tears he was too exhausted to hide. "Why are you doing this?" "Because Ilara would have wanted them to have a chance. And because you're family now, whether you like it or not." The trust was established within a week. But Glenn didn't stop there. He noticed the mold creeping up Vincent's bathroom wall, the rattling window that let in February cold, the broken lock on the front door, the building that wasn't safe for 2 babies learning to crawl. "Come with me," Glenn said one morning. "I want to show you something." He drove Vincent to a legal aid clinic he'd quietly been funding for years, introduced him to a housing attorney who specialized in tenant rights. Together, they filed complaints, documented violations, built a case. "I could just buy you a place," Glenn said during the drive home. "I know, but you're not." Vincent looked over at him. "You're teaching me how to fight for it myself. That's different. Ilara would have done it this way. She always believed people deserved dignity, not charity. She talked about you, you know, more than you probably think." Vincent's voice went soft. "She said you were a good man who'd forgotten how to be a good father. She wanted to believe you could remember. Glenn's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The letter sat unread in his desk drawer. He still couldn't bring himself to open it. But what neither of them knew was that the legal case Vincent had just filed would attract attention Glenn hadn't anticipated. The building's owner was connected, powerful, and very angry that Glenn Murdoch was involving himself in tenant rights battles. Within 48 hours, Glenn would receive a call that would force him to choose between protecting Vincent and the twins, or protecting his business empire. Meanwhile, Julian had been watching, learning, preparing. He knew about the trust fund, the legal clinic, the early morning visits, and every act of redemption his father performed felt like a personal insult. Like Glenn was giving these strangers the father Julian had begged for his entire childhood and never received. Julian's resentment was reaching a breaking point. And when resentment in powerful families reaches critical mass, it doesn't just hurt the person carrying it, it destroys everyone in its path. Have you ever watched someone in your family get the version of a parent you always needed but never had? How did it make you feel? Tell us in the comments. Glenn had been avoiding this call for 3 weeks. Every time he picked up the phone to dial Julian's number, his thumb hovered over the screen, then retreated. But watching Leo take his first wobbly steps across Vincent's apartment floor changed something. The way the boy's face lit up when he didn't fall, the pure joy of a small victory. Glenn realized he couldn't build a new family while leaving the old one shattered. He called Julian on a Thursday evening. The phone rang 4 times before his son answered, and the silence that followed Glenn's hello felt like ice water. "It's been 8 months since I've heard from you," Julian said finally. His voice was controlled, professional, empty. "What do you want?" "I need to see you. There's something important we need to discuss." "Important enough to call your son? Must be serious." The sarcasm was sharp enough to draw blood. "Julian, please. This isn't—" "Fine, Saturday. 1 p.m. The Gramercy. Don't be late like you were for my college graduation." "Oh, wait. You didn't come to that at all, did you?" The line went dead. Glenn sat in the restaurant 45 minutes early, watching the door like a prisoner waiting for judgment. When Julian finally walked in, Glenn barely recognized him. His son was 32 now, but he looked older, harder. He wore an expensive suit that probably cost more than Vincent made in 3 months, and his resemblance to Glenn was almost painful to see. "You look well," Glenn offered. "Skip the pleasantries." Julian sat down without shaking his father's hand. "What's this about?" Glenn had rehearsed this conversation 100 times. Every version ended badly. He decided the truth was the only way through. "You have a niece and nephew. Twins. They're 13 months old." Julian's face went blank, then red. "What are you talking about?" "Ilara had children before she died. She kept them secret." Glenn's voice remained steady despite his racing heart. "Their father died before she did. A friend of his, a young man named Vincent, has been raising them alone. I've been helping him, getting to know them." "You've been—" Julian's voice rose, drawing looks from nearby tables. He leaned in, lowering his volume, but not his intensity. "You've been playing grandfather to some stranger's kids, while I haven't heard from you in 8 months? They're not some stranger's kids. They're Ilara's. Did you do a DNA test? Or did you just take this Vincent's word for it? How much money has he gotten out of you already?" Julian's eyes were cold, calculating. "This is a scam, Dad. An elaborate, well-played scam. I did the test. They're Ilara's children. Your niece and nephew." Julian sat back like he'd been slapped. For a moment, something vulnerable flickered across his face. Hurt. Loss. The little boy who'd once worshipped his father before learning that worship was wasted on an empty shrine. But what Glenn saw next made his blood run cold. That vulnerability hardened into something else. Something Glenn recognized because he'd seen it in mirrors for years. Bitterness. The kind that calcifies around your heart until you can't feel anything else. "So let me get this straight." Julian's voice dropped to something dangerous. "Ilara had babies. Secret babies. And rather than come to her family, rather than ask her brother for help, she gave them to some random guy and died without telling anyone." He leaned forward. "Do you know why she did that, Dad? Do you want to know why your daughter trusted a stranger more than her own family?" Glenn's throat closed. "Because of you." Julian's words were precise, surgical. "Because you made this family so toxic, so cold, so focused on success and image and money that she knew she couldn't come home, that none of us could." His voice broke slightly. "I had to learn about my sister's children from an anonymous text with a photo of you holding a baby. Do you have any idea how that felt?" "Julian, I'm sorry." "Don't!" Julian held up his hand. "Don't apologize. You've been apologizing my whole life while changing nothing. You missed my 5th birthday for a merger. You missed my middle school graduation for a conference. You missed my wedding because you were closing a deal that apparently couldn't wait 6 hours." His eyes glistened, but no tears fell. "And now you're calling me because you need something. Not because you miss me, not because you want to repair our relationship, but because you're trying to build a new family. And I'm an inconvenient loose end." "That's not true." "Then tell me, Dad, when was the last time you called me just to talk? When was the last time you asked about my life, my work, my marriage, of us? When was the last time I was enough of a priority to warrant your attention without some crisis forcing your hand?" Glenn opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Because Julian was right. Every word was a mirror held up to decades of failure. "That's what I thought." Julian stood up, straightening his tie. "You want to play grandfather? Fine. You want to ease your guilt by helping these kids? Great. But don't pretend this is about family. This is about you trying to buy redemption because you finally realized money can't fill the hole where your heart should be." He turned to leave, then stopped. "And Dad? That letter Ilara left you, the one I know you haven't opened yet because you're too much of a coward? Read it. Maybe then you'll understand why we all left you long before we actually left." Julian walked out of the restaurant, leaving Glenn alone with a truth he'd been running from his entire life. He hadn't just failed Ilara. He'd failed everyone who'd ever tried to love him. Glenn's hands shook as he pulled out his phone and looked at the photo Vincent had sent that morning. Leo and Mia playing with blocks, innocent, trusting, unaware that their grandfather was a man who destroyed everything he touched. Maybe Julian was right. Maybe Glenn didn't deserve a second chance. Maybe some mistakes were too big to fix, some damage too deep to heal. But sitting in that restaurant, surrounded by the ghosts of every moment he'd chosen wrong, Glenn made a decision. He would read Ilara's letter. Tonight. Whatever it said, whatever truth it held, he would finally face it. Because if he was going to be in these children's lives, if he was going to be family to Vincent and earn his son's forgiveness, He had to stop running from who he'd been and start becoming who he should have been all along. When someone you love confronts you with years of accumulated pain, is it ever too late to make things right? Or are some wounds so deep that apologies become just another form of violence? Glenn read the letter that night. He sat in his study with a glass of scotch he never touched, Ilara's handwriting blurring through tears he'd held back for 13 months. The letter wasn't long, just 2 pages, but every word was a knife. "Dad, I'm writing this because I need you to know the truth, even if I'm too afraid to tell you while I'm alive. I'm pregnant. Twins. The father is a mechanic named Matteo, and I love him more than I've ever loved anyone. I know you'll think I'm throwing my life away. I know you'll say he's not good enough. That's why I can't tell you. Because the last time I brought someone home, do you even remember? His name was Marcus. I was 19. You took one look at him, saw he was on financial aid, and said, 'I didn't raise you to settle for mediocrity.' He heard you. We broke up that week. I've never forgiven you for that. I won't let you do it again. So these babies will never know their grandfather. I'm sorry, but I have to protect them from the cold fortress you call love. If you're reading this, I'm gone. Please don't try to find them. Let them be raised by people who know how to be warm. Ilara." Glenn's hands shook so badly he dropped the pages. She'd been right about everything, and now she was dead, and he had one last chance to prove she'd been wrong about one thing. He could learn to be warm. He called Julian at midnight. "What now?" His son's voice was rough with sleep and residual anger. "You were right. About everything. I read Ilara's letter. Julian, Glenn's voice broke. I need help. I don't know how to fix this alone." The silence stretched so long Glenn thought he'd hung up. "Where are they?" Julian finally asked. 2 days later, Julian stood outside Vincent's apartment building, staring at the cracked concrete and broken mailboxes. His Mercedes looked obscene parked on this street. He almost turned around 3 times before finally walking up those stairs. Vincent answered the door with Mia on his hip, looking surprised and wary. "You must be Julian." "Glenn told you I was coming. He said you might." "Didn't say you would." Vincent stepped aside. "Come in, I guess." The apartment was even smaller than Julian had imagined, but it was clean, loved, photos taped to the walls, children's books everywhere. Leo sat on the floor, stacking blocks with intense concentration. Julian stood frozen in the doorway, the same way Glenn had weeks before. "They look like her," he whispered. "Yeah, they really do." Vincent shifted Mia higher. "You want to meet your niece?" Julian nodded, unable to speak. Vincent placed Mia in his arms, and she immediately grabbed his tie, just like she had with Glenn. She looked up at him with those amber eyes, Ilara's eyes, and something inside Julian's chest shattered. He started crying. Not dignified tears, ugly, desperate sobs that shook his whole body. All the anger he'd carried for 20 years, all the resentment toward his father, suddenly felt small compared to this. Ilara was gone. But these babies were here. Alive. Real. Family he never knew he had. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "I don't know why It's okay, man." Vincent's voice was gentle. "I cried for 3 days straight when they were born. Grief is weird when it gets mixed up with new life." Julian looked at him. Really looked. Vincent couldn't have been more than 26, living in poverty, raising someone else's children, working 2 jobs. No complaint, no bitterness, just love and exhaustion. "How do you do this?" Julian asked. How do you keep going? Because they need me, and because Mateo would have done the same for me. Vincent sat down on the futon. Also, I have no choice. You don't get to quit on kids. Something about those words hit Julian hard. His father had quit. On him. On Ilara. Over and over. But Vincent hadn't. Despite having every reason to walk away, he stayed. What do you need? Julian heard himself ask. To make this easier, what do you need? Vincent laughed, but it wasn't bitter. Sleep. About 17 hours of sleep. I'm serious. So am I. Vincent looked at the twins, then at Julian. Your dad's been helping, showing up every morning, learning how to change diapers at 68 years old. It's awkward as hell, but he's trying. That's more than I expected. He's trying to fix his mistakes. Maybe. Or maybe he just finally figured out what actually matters. Vincent met his eyes. Look, I don't know your history with him, but I know mine with my dad. He left when I was 3 and I haven't seen him since. So when Glenn Murdoch shows up in a Tom Ford suit to learn how to burp a baby, that tells me something. People don't change because they want to. They change because they have to. And your dad? He finally hit bottom. Julian sat down on the floor next to Leo, who immediately handed him a block. The simple gesture, a child sharing a toy, made his throat tight. I was so angry at him, Julian admitted. I still am, but seeing them... He looked at the twins. I don't want to be my father. I don't want these kids to grow up feeling like I felt. Then don't be him. Be better. Vincent's voice was matter-of-fact. That's all any of us can do. Be better than the people who hurt us. Over the next 2 weeks, something unexpected happened. Julian started showing up. Not every day like Glenn, but enough. He'd stop by after work, still in his suit, and sit on Vincent's floor, playing blocks with Leo, or reading board books to Mia in ridiculous voices that made her giggle. He and Vincent developed an easy friendship, bonding over their shared status as outsiders in Glenn's world. Vincent taught Julian how to properly install a car seat. Julian helped Vincent navigate the legal paperwork for the apartment case. They ordered terrible Chinese food and assembled baby furniture at midnight, laughing at instructions that made no sense. And slowly, awkwardly, painfully, Julian and Glenn began to rebuild something. Not the relationship they'd had. That was gone, burned to ash by years of neglect. But something new, something honest. One evening, the 3 of them, Glenn, Julian, and Vincent, sat in the tiny apartment while the twins slept. They were tired, covered in spit-up and crushed Cheerios. Glenn's expensive watch had a scratch from Leo's toy truck. Julian's designer shirt had a stain he couldn't identify. We look ridiculous, Julian said. We look like family, Glenn corrected quietly. Vincent raised his coffee mug. To the weirdest family I never asked for. They drank to that. And for the first time in longer than any of them could remember, it felt like maybe, just maybe, broken things could be rebuilt into something stronger than they'd been before. But none of them knew that across town, someone else had been learning about Ilara's children. Someone with legal rights and bitter memories and an agenda that would threaten everything they'd just started building. Subscribe if you believe broken families can be rebuilt stronger than they were before. Only those who think the past defines the future will not subscribe. Serafina Murdoch, Ilara's mother, Glenn's ex-wife, had just hired a lawyer, and she wasn't coming to join the family. She was coming to take the twins away. Have you ever bonded with someone over shared pain or shared outsider status. Sometimes the people who understand us best are the ones who've been hurt the same way. The lawyer's letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Vincent signed for it, thinking it was about the apartment case. Instead, he found himself reading a petition for emergency custody filed by Serafina Murdoch, née Harrison, claiming she was the rightful guardian of her deceased daughter's children. His hands went numb. He called Glenn immediately. "Your ex-wife is suing me for the twins." Glenn's voice went cold. "I'm on my way." But what Glenn didn't tell Vincent was that he'd been expecting this. Serafina had called him 3 days earlier, her voice sharp with accusation and pain. "You knew about Ilara's children, and you didn't tell me? What kind of monster keeps a grandmother from her grandchildren?" "Serafina, let me explain. 13 months, Glenn. They've been alive for 13 months, and you kept them from me." Her voice cracked. "I lost my daughter. You don't get to take my grandchildren too." She'd hung up before he could respond. Now she sat in Glenn's penthouse, her lawyer beside her, looking every bit the formidable woman who'd once been Manhattan's most sought-after art curator. At 59, Serafina was striking. Silver hair cut sharp, designer clothes that whispered old money, and eyes that could cut glass when she was angry, and which she very much was. "I want to meet them," she said without preamble, when Glenn, Julian, and Vincent arrived. "Today, now." "Mrs. Murdoch, with all due respect," Vincent started. "You don't get to, with all due respect, me." Serafina's gaze fixed on him. "You're 26 years old, playing house with my daughter's children, while their actual family was kept in the dark. What gave you the right?" "Matteo gave me the right. Legally. And Ilara knew. She chose this." "Ilara was a child who was scared of her father." Serafina's voice rose. "She didn't know I existed as an option because Glenn and I divorced when she was 12, and he made sure I was the villain in every story." Glenn flinched, because that part was also true. "Mom," Julian's voice was measured, careful. "Attacking Vincent won't help. Don't mom me." "You knew about this too?" Her eyes glistened with tears she refused to shed. "My own son kept this from me?" "I only found out 2 weeks ago. Glenn called me." "Of course he did. Glenn calls his son. Glenn shows up for his grandchildren. Glenn gets his redemption arc while I'm left out in the cold like I've always been." She turned to her ex-husband. "You haven't changed at all. Still making unilateral decisions. Still playing God with other people's lives." The words hit their mark. Glenn's shoulders sagged. "You're right. I should have called you the moment I found out. I was wrong." Serafina blinked, momentarily thrown. Glenn Murdoch never admitted he was wrong. "I'm not trying to keep you from them," Glenn continued. "I'm trying to protect them. Vincent has been their guardian since birth. Legally, emotionally, in every way that matters. If you sue him, you'll traumatize those children by ripping them from the only parent they've ever known." "I'm not trying to take them away," Serafina said, but her lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "I just want to be part of their lives." "Then drop the lawsuit," Vincent said quietly. "Meet them. Be their grandmother. But don't make this a war. They've lost enough already." Serafina studied him for a long moment. Something in his face, the exhaustion, the sincerity, the fierce protectiveness, seemed to reach her. "I want to meet them. Today. If I think they're safe and loved, I'll consider dropping the petition." 2 hours later, Serafina stood in Vincent's apartment, staring at the twins like she was seeing ghosts. Mia had Ilara's curls. Leo had her nose. Together, they were an echo of the daughter she'd lost. She covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "They look just like her," she whispered. "They are her," Vincent said softly. "The best parts of her." Serafina knelt down slowly. Mia toddled over, curious about this new person. She reached up and touched Serafina's face, the way children do when they're trying to understand something. "Hi, sweet girl," Serafina's voice broke. "I'm your grandmother." Mia smiled and handed her a plastic dinosaur. Something inside Serafina crumbled. All the anger, the bitterness, the years of being shut out of her children's lives by Glenn's coldness and her own mistakes. It all melted in the face of this innocent gesture. These babies hadn't asked to be born into a broken family. They deserved better than adults fighting over them. "Tell me about them," she said to Vincent. "Everything. I want to know everything." Over the next 3 hours, Vincent told her their story. Matteo and Ilara's love, the secret pregnancy, Matteo's death, Ilara's accident, the sleepless nights and tiny victories and moments of joy that came with raising twins alone. Serafina listened, crying quietly, asking questions, watching the babies with a hunger that came from 13 months of not knowing they existed. Glenn and Julian watched from the small kitchen, giving them space. "She's good with them," Julian observed. "She was always good with you and Ilara. When she was allowed to be." Glenn's voice was heavy with old regrets. "I poisoned that too. Are you going to spend the rest of your life cataloging your failures, or are you going to help fix this?" Julian's tone was sharp but not unkind. "I'm trying. Try harder." When Serafina finally left that evening, she pulled Glenn aside in the hallway. "I'm dropping the custody petition, on one condition." "Name it." "We co-grandparent. You don't make decisions about these children without consulting me. You don't shut me out. And you don't try to control this situation like you controlled our marriage." Her eyes were steel. "I'll be civil for the twins' sake. But don't mistake civility for forgiveness. You destroyed our family once. I won't let you do it again." "Agreed," Glenn said simply. She studied his face, looking for the manipulation, the angle, the hidden agenda. But all she saw was a tired old man who'd finally run out of moves. "You really have changed, haven't you?" she said, surprised. "I'm trying to. It's harder than building an empire." "Good." "It should be." She turned toward the elevator, then paused. "Glenn? Thank you for calling me. Eventually." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. Back in the apartment, Vincent collapsed on the futon, emotionally drained. Glenn and Julian had stayed to help clean up the chaos of the afternoon. "That went better than expected," Julian said, picking up scattered toys. "She's going to be around a lot now," Vincent said. "Are we ready for that?" Glenn thought about the question. A few months ago, the idea of navigating his ex-wife's presence would have sent him spiraling. But now, watching Leo sleep peacefully in his crib and Mia clutching her plastic dinosaur, he realized something had fundamentally shifted in him. "We'll figure it out," Glenn said. "That's what families do." And for the first time in decades, the 4 adults in that tiny apartment, Glenn, Serafina, Julian, and Vincent, were actually acting like one. Messy, complicated, held together by 2 innocent babies who had no idea they were performing a miracle. But miracles, like families, require constant maintenance, and none of them knew that the greatest test was still ahead. Because in exactly 3 weeks, The twins would turn 1 year old, and the birthday party Glenn was planning would force everyone to confront the question they'd all been avoiding. What happens when a family built on second chances has to face the people they used to be? Sometimes the people we've hurt the most are the ones we need most to rebuild with. Have you ever had to work alongside someone you'd wronged to create something new? How did you navigate that tension? Glenn woke up on the twins' first birthday and did something he hadn't done in 13 months. He didn't drive to the cemetery. For over a year, every significant date had been marked at Ilara's grave. Her birthday, the anniversary of her death, holidays. Glenn would stand there with flowers and guilt, talking to marble that couldn't answer. But today felt different. Today he wanted to celebrate life instead of mourning loss. Vincent's apartment couldn't hold everyone, so Glenn had rented a small community center, the same one where Ilara and Matteo had met. It felt right somehow. Full circle. The decorations were modest. Balloons, streamers, a homemade banner that said, "Happy First Birthday Leo and Mia," in crooked letters that Julian had insisted on painting himself. Nothing extravagant, nothing that screamed Murdoch wealth, just simple joys. Glenn arrived early to help set up, his expensive suit replaced with jeans and a sweater that Mia had already spit up on twice that week. He didn't care. Vincent came in carrying both twins, looking overwhelmed. "I can't believe they're already 1. "They grow fast," Serafina said, walking in behind them with a cake she'd baked herself. Not hired a pastry chef. Baked, with her own hands. Glenn had forgotten she used to bake. Julian arrived with his wife Emma, who Glenn had only met once at their wedding he'd almost missed. She looked nervous, but when Mia reached for her, something softened in her face. "She's beautiful," Emma whispered to Julian. "They both are," he said, bouncing Leo. "They're family." The party was small, just the 6 adults and the twins. No business associates, no society photographers. No one who needed to be impressed. Just family. Broken, rebuilt, trying. They sang Happy Birthday off-key. The twins demolished their smash cakes with gleeful abandon, getting frosting everywhere. Leo tried to eat a candle. Mia laughed so hard she got hiccups. It was chaotic and messy and perfect. Glenn watched it all from the side, his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't name. Pride? Gratitude? Relief? Maybe all 3. But what happened next broke him completely. Vincent gathered everyone together and cleared his throat. "Before we go, I want to say something." He looked at Glenn, then at Serafina and Julian. "A year ago, I was alone with 2 newborns, terrified I'd mess them up. I had no family, no backup plan, just me and the promise I made to Matteo." His voice thickened. "But these kids aren't alone anymore. They have a grandfather who shows up every morning even when it's hard. They have an uncle who reads them books in ridiculous voices. They have a grandmother who bakes cakes and knows all the lullabies I don't." He looked at Emma. "They have an aunt who's learning, and they have all of you trying, really trying, to be better than you were." Glenn's eyes burned. "Matteo and Ilara should be here. Every day I wake up angry that they're not." Vincent's tears fell freely now. "But if they can't be here, I'm grateful their children have you, all of you. That's what Ilara would have wanted, not perfection, just people who love them enough to keep showing up." Serafina was crying. Julian wiped his eyes. Even Emma, who barely knew these people, was blinking back tears. Glenn stepped forward, his voice barely steady. "Ilara wrote me a letter before she died. She said she was protecting Leo and Mia from the cold fortress I called love. He looked around the room. She was right. For most of my life, I built walls instead of bridges. I chose success over connection, money over meaning, and I lost everything that mattered because of it. He knelt down beside the twins, who were covered in cake and completely oblivious to the emotion in the room. But these two gave me something I didn't deserve. A second chance. And I'm not going to waste it. Julian joined him on the floor, then Serafina, then Vincent, then Emma, all of them surrounding Leo and Mia, this family that had been shattered and was slowly, painfully, beautifully piecing itself back together. They took a photo, 6 adults and 2 babies covered in frosting, crying and laughing at the same time. It wasn't posed, it wasn't perfect, but it was real. Glenn kept that photo on his desk for the rest of his life. A reminder that some things, once broken, can't be fixed. They have to be rebuilt into something entirely new, something stronger. As everyone packed up to leave, Serafina touched Glenn's arm. She would have been proud of you today, of all of us. I hope so, Glenn said. I know so. She squeezed his hand once, then let go. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was grace, and sometimes grace is enough to start with. Vincent strapped the twins into their car seats, both of them already falling asleep. Same time tomorrow? He asked Glenn. Same time, Glenn confirmed. Julian walked out with his arm around Emma. Serafina drove off with a promise to come by on Wednesday. And Glenn stood in the parking lot of the community center where his daughter had fallen in love, where her children had just celebrated their first year of life. And he felt something he hadn't felt in over a decade. Peace. The journey wasn't over. Healing never is. There would be hard days ahead, disagreements, old wounds that still ached. But for the first time, Glenn believed they could navigate it. Together. Because that's what families do. They break. They rebuild. They show up. They try. And sometimes, if they're lucky, they get to celebrate birthdays instead of standing at graves. Glenn drove home that night and finally threw away the flowers he'd been buying every Tuesday for 13 months. He didn't need them anymore. He had something better. He had family. What does a second chance mean to you? Is it about erasing the past? Or about building something new from the broken pieces? Sometimes the most powerful redemption isn't forgetting what we did wrong. It's using that pain to love better going forward. 6 months after the twins' first birthday, Glenn stood in front of a property he'd owned for 12 years and never visited. It was a sprawling estate in Westchester, purchased as an investment and forgotten like so many other things in his life. The house had sat empty, locked, slowly filling with dust and silence. But today, it would become something else entirely. Glenn had spent those 6 months planning, consulting, arguing with architects who wanted to preserve the elegant minimalism while he demanded warmth. He'd studied photos of Vincent's cramped apartment, noting every detail that made it feel like home, despite having nothing. The worn blankets, the hand-drawn pictures taped to walls, the plastic bins of toys, the evidence of life being lived. He wanted to recreate that feeling. Not the poverty, the love. The renovation team had finished last week. Glenn had made them redo the kitchen 3 times until it felt right. Not a showpiece. A place where actual people would cook actual meals and spill actual juice boxes. He'd insisted on a massive family room with furniture designed to be jumped on. Bedrooms for everyone: Vincent, the twins, Julian and Emma when they visited, even a guest room for Serafina. But the most important part was outside. Glenn walked through the back door into the garden he'd spent months obsessing over. Not a manicured showpiece maintained by a landscaping crew, a real garden, the kind Ilara had always dreamed about. He'd found her journal in Vincent's apartment, filled with sketches and notes. "Someday I want a garden with wildflowers that look messy but are actually planned," she'd written at 19. "A vegetable patch where kids can dig in the dirt. A tree with a swing. A place that feels alive." Glenn had built exactly that. Wildflowers bloomed in carefully orchestrated chaos. Raised beds held tomatoes and herbs and strawberries the twins could reach. A massive oak tree stood in the corner, a wooden swing already hanging from its strongest branch. Garden stones formed a winding path, and Glenn had commissioned an artist to carve one special stone with simple words: "Ilara's garden, where love grows wild." He knelt beside that stone now, running his fingers over his daughter's name. "I'm sorry I never gave you this," he whispered. "I'm sorry for so many things, but I'm trying to give your children what I couldn't give you. A home. Not a fortress. A home." The sound of tires on gravel made him look up. Vincent's beat-up Honda pulled into the driveway. Glenn had offered to buy him a new car a dozen times. Vincent had refused every time. "This one still runs," he'd said. "That's enough." Vincent got out, staring at the house with wide eyes. Julian's Mercedes pulled up behind him, and then Serafina's Range Rover. Glenn had invited them all, but told them nothing about what he'd done. "Dad, what is this?" Julian asked, climbing out. "It's home," Glenn said simply. "For all of us, if you'll have it." Vincent was shaking his head, overwhelmed. "Glenn, this is too much. It's not a gift. It's not charity." Glenn's voice was firm but gentle. "It's family. The twins need space to grow. You need help. We all need to be together." He gestured toward the house. "There's a room for you. Rooms for Leo and Mia. A home office where you can finish the degree you put on hold. A yard where they can play. And a family who will be here to help raise them." "I can't accept this," Vincent said, but his voice wavered. "Yes, you can. Because it's not just for you. It's for them." Glenn pointed at the twins, who Serafina was already lifting from their car seats. "And because Matteo would have wanted them to have this, a real home, a real family." Vincent's eyes filled with tears. "Matteo would have loved this garden. I know. Ilara wrote about it, about wanting to grow vegetables with her kids someday, about teaching them that beautiful things take patience and care." Glenn's voice caught. "I never gave her patience or care, but I can give it to them." Serafina carried the twins into the garden. Mia's eyes went wide at the flowers. Leo pointed at the swing and squealed. They toddled forward on unsteady legs, exploring this new world with the fearless joy only children possess. Glenn watched them, his heart so full it ached. Julian stood beside him. "You really did it. You actually changed." "I'm still changing," Glenn corrected. "Every day. It's harder than anything I've ever done." "Good," Julian said, but he was smiling. "Means it's real." They spent that afternoon exploring the house together. Vincent kept touching walls like he couldn't believe they were solid. Serafina cried when she saw the room Glenn had designated as hers, For when you want to stay over with the twins, he'd said. Julian and Emma discovered the converted garage that Glenn had turned into a workshop, thinking maybe Julian would finally have space for the woodworking hobby he'd mentioned once, 7 years ago, that Glenn had actually remembered. But it was the garden where they all ended up as the sun began to set. The twins played in the grass. Vincent pushed Mia on the swing. Serafina showed Leo how to smell the flowers. Julian and Emma sat on a bench, talking quietly about their own future children who might play here someday. And Glenn stood by Ilara's stone, watching the family he'd almost destroyed now thriving in the space he'd built from his mistakes. "You did it, didn't you?" Serafina said softly, joining him. "You actually became the man you should have been." "No," Glenn said honestly. "I became something different. I can't erase who I was. Can't undo the damage. But I can be present for who they're becoming." She studied his face. "Ilara would have forgiven you eventually. She had a soft heart under all that hurt. Maybe, but I don't need her forgiveness anymore. I need to earn theirs." He gestured toward Leo and Mia. "Every single day for the rest of my life." As darkness fell, they moved inside. Glenn had stocked the kitchen with food. They cooked together, badly, chaotically, with too many people in too small a space, even though the kitchen was enormous. They ate at a table that actually fit everyone. They laughed at Vincent's terrible jokes and Serafina's stories about Ilara as a little girl. Later, after the twins were asleep in their new cribs in their new room, the adults sat in the family room, exhausted, happy, together. "To second chances," Julian raised his glass. "To families rebuilt," Serafina added. "To showing up," Vincent said quietly. Glenn raised his glass but didn't speak. He didn't need to. Everything he wanted to say was in this house, this garden, these people who'd given him more grace than he deserved. He'd spent 68 years building an empire of glass and steel. It had taken him less than a year to learn that the only thing worth building was this: connection, presence, love that showed up even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. That night, Glenn slept in his new room, smaller than his penthouse master suite, simpler, with walls he could hear the twins through when they woke up crying. And for the first time since Ilara's death, he slept through the night, because he wasn't haunted by ghosts anymore. He was surrounded by life. Maybe redemption isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming present, every day, for the rest of your life. Subscribe if you believe love and presence matter more than money and success. Only those who value power over people will not subscribe. And in the comments, tell us, what dream are you still trying to fulfill for someone you love?
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine, so do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.